Articulating the Dead. Vernon Lee, Decadence, and the Doll. He thought for a long time of how the closed eyes of dead women could still live, how they could open again, in a quiet lamplit room, long after they had looked their last. They had looks that survived, had them as great poets had quoted lines. Henry James, The Altar of the Dead, 1895. The abnormality of the hovering, prowling, blighting presences he wished to install at Bly, James felt certain, depended upon his departing altogether from the rules. Preface, 175. That he should speak so familiarly of the rules governing late 19th century horror might have come as something of a surprise to his friend Vernon Lee, to whom, nearly 20 years before he had announced in the preface to the Osborne papers that good ghosts, speaking by book, make poor subjects, he had colloquially confided that the supernatural story, the subject wrought in fantasy, is not the class of fiction I myself most cherish, prejudiced as you may have perceived me in favor of. A close connotation, or close observation, of the real, or whatever one may call it, the familiar, the inevitable. One, the occasion for this perhaps not altogether ingenuous confession was his reception of Lee's first collection of ghost stories, Hauntings, 1890, which he characterized as gruesome, graceful, genialish, although his good opinion of the bold, aggressive speculative fancy discernible in Lee's work would have been enhanced by her prefatory disclaimer that no genuine ghosts in the scientific sense were to be discovered in her. 4 little tales, which told of no hauntings such as could be contributed by the Society for Psychical Research, of no specters that can be caught in definite places and made to dictate to judicial evidence, too, an abjuration that James would duplicate in his eventual disavowal of the mere modern psychical case, washed clean of all queernesses as by exposure to a flowing laboratory tap. Preface, 169. One might expect that Lee would have valued the shared perspective of an individual whose work she held in such high regard that she dedicated to him her first and only novel, but in fact such was not the case, and the cooling of their subsequent relations is attributable at least in part to her growing suspicion that James deliberately obscured his indebtedness to her. Point 3. Could she have known that her own rather prodigious body of work, as well as the influence that it subtly exerted, would until very recently suffer and neglect? That Van Wyck Brooks characterized as genteelly self-imposed, her gift has been so gracious that she seems not to have asked for austere consideration. James's perceived oversight would perhaps have struck her as ironically portentous. Point 4. When one suggests that a writer has been relegated to an undeserved obscurity, there is often but not always an implication that in her own day she was noted, or deservedly popular. Yet Vernon Lee, the nom de plume of Violet Paget, was not a popular writer in her own lifetime. Born in 1856, dying in 1935, she was admired and feared by her contemporaries, and although she enjoyed something of a vogue during the teens and 20s, she was an unabashedly elitist author who demanded of her readers a peculiar conjunction of culture, taste, leisure, and what Bernard Shaw described as a cosmopolitan intellectualism with which few, in the event, were actually equipped, and it is in fact her distinguished view of life that Brooks ironically credited as preventing her from acquiring popularly a clear-cut form. 5. It was Lee whom Shaw cited when he argued that it is possible to be born in England and yet have intellect, to train English minds as well as English muscles, conveniently ignoring or overlooking the fact that she was born of English parents then living at Boulogne, and that for most of her life she lived as an expatriate in the art centers of Western Europe. Point 6. Designating her as the most able mind in Florence. Elsewhere, privately, he termed her as a monstrous cerebration. James described this belletrist as being as dangerous and uncanny as she is intelligent, which is saying a great deal. Her vigor and sweep are most rare and her talk superior altogether. Draw it mild with her on the question of friendship, he urged his brother William, underscoring his warning by means of a comparison that transformed Lee into a potentially wild creature to be encountered with circumspection, but don't caress her. She's a tiger cat. 7. In his portrait of Lee, her childhood friend John Singer Sargent caught the way her features expressed a lively sardonic intelligence, figure 29, but to many of her male contemporaries her formidable powers of self-assertion seemed threatening. Perhaps regretting that in his list of experiences that one ought not to miss during one's visit to Florence, the Pitti, the Uffizi, the Bargello, the Academia, he had included Miss Paget to quarrel with. John Addington Symonds attempted to persuade Lee to soften her manner on the principle that it was possible to be frank without being flippant, rude, or patronizing, and firm without appearing to have posed as an oracle. There is a certain grave and measured way of expressing difference, with accepted wisdom, a certain caution and reserve in asserting our own opinions. W.H. Sick. I have always been sorry to see you, Miss. 8. Max Beerbohm made his own feelings plain in a portrait that he, perhaps wisely, reserved for his own private delectation. The tenacity and volubility with which she expressed her most cherished views, as her biographer Peter Gunn puts it, exceeded the restrained good taste demanded by so dandiacal a social critic as Max Beerbohm, who tipped into the title page of his copy of Gospels of Anarchy, 1908, an engraving of a bonnet middle-aged lady drinking tea, a portrait that he annotated, to suit the refinement of his malice. Accordingly, oh dear, poor dear dreadful little lady, always having a crow to pick, ever so coyly, with Nietzsche, or a wee lance to break with Mr. Carlyle, or a sweet but sharp little warning to whisper in the ear of Mr. H.G. Wells, or Strindberg, or Darwin, or D'Annunzio. What a dreadful little bore and busybody. How artfully at this moment she must be buttonholing Einstein and Senior Croce and Mr. James Joyce. 9. A prolific writer, she had produced, by the age of 24, a highly regarded history of 18th century Italy, which was followed by a number of volumes of essays on aesthetic matters. It was, in fact, Lee who introduced the concept of empathy into the vocabulary of Anglo-Saxon aesthetics. The essays contained in her genius loci collections have traditionally been considered to be her most compelling, and her sensitivity to subtle impressions of place prompted Robert Browning to lionize her in a poem entitled Inapprehensiveness, included in his Asolando, Fancies and Facts, 1899. No, the book, which noticed how the wall growths wave, said she, was not by Ruskin. I said, Vernon Lee. The Monstrosities of Miss Brown, 1884, her shapeless novel belie her skills as a writer of the supernatural fictions that have received less attention than have her collections of essays, although in recent years they have been rediscovered by critics who have come to recognize in them, as did Edith Wharton, her most purely imaginative as well as her most deeply personal work. Point 10. Invoking a highly finished, arabesque, yellow style that functioned, in such pieces, as a projection of and correlative to the fevered states of mind that the decadents sought to cultivate, the majority of her stories, written between 1886 and 1899, conformed to the requirements of the sort of literary decadence that was characteristic of fin de siècle male fantasy fiction, although Beerbohm's caricature of Lee as a bonnet blue stocking places her in the midst of what Elaine Showalter has called the threatening daughters of decadence, whose own brand of perversion, as she elsewhere notes, was denigrated as being peculiar to new women writers, shriveled prudes whose malign influence enervated a virile male genre. 11 as fully disputatious, contradictious, and perverse as she was credited with being. The assessment is James's. Lee's explications of her aesthetic suggest that she would have abjured a strict affiliation with literary decadence while scorning to entertain the secondary implication, although her works are in fact tinged with the same ambivalence that is to be found in the works of writers more readily associated with the decadent milieu. 12 An Englishwoman of the English, Bernard Shaw's designation, who had lived, as Mario Praz reminds us, all of her life intellectually and aesthetically in a world redolent of the hothouse, reared in the country that had provided the setting for the Marble Faun, 1860, a book that Lee confessed to have been perpetually reading in Sargent's company, while her own literary productions would come to be imbued, as James thought, deeply with the redo lens of the unspeakable Italy. Lee seems to have waged a lifelong struggle with certain aspects of her own artistry. 13 Although she was a self-proclaimed aesthetician, for example, she became preoccupied, following her first official visit to England in the summer of 1881, with what she perceived as a decadent and erotic strain in aestheticism, and this growing knowledge, as Leonie Ormond reminds us, disgusted her. 14 Yet her writings reflect precisely the strain, her artistic vision at times running afoul of what James called her too moral a passion, so that having, at the age of 24, introduced her own studies of the 18th century in Italy, 1880, as the work of neither a literary historian nor a musical critic, but an aesthetician, she could set about deconstructing aestheticism, attacking the so-called fleshly school in a lumbering multi-volume novel that James saw as strangely without delicacy or fineness and deplored as a mistake to be repented of. 15 Weighing Lee's bristling distrust of pure aesthetics and downright distaste for aestheticism and art for art's sake against her reverence for art that was nothing short of religious in its intensity, Vinetta Colby speculates that operating always within her was a kind of puritanical vigilance far more subtle and refined, thanks to her European background, than that of the English philistine, but persistent and persuasive. 16. The question mark that concludes the subtitle of Ruth Robbins's recent reconsideration, Vernon Lee, Decadent Woman, registers not only the apparently self-contradictory attitudes embedded in but also the confusion that marks the history of criticism generated by her work. In his study of decadent style, for example, John R. Reed characterizes Lee as ill-disposed to aesthetes, whereas Albert Ziebau, in his literary history of England, connects Lee's name with those of Symonds and Pater, the latter of whom she designated master in her adulatory conclusion to Renaissance fancies and studies. 1895.17 In his review of her Juvenilia, 1887, a volume of essays on aesthetic questions intended to supplement those that she had posed in Belcaro, 1881, Pater judged that the force of her skill resided both in her prose style, at times plethoric and contorted, though also rich, varied, and expressive, and, more particularly, in the picturesque, romantic, and wholly modern sensibility that she brings to bear on the subjects of her interest. Pater concludes his review with an allusion to the ethical tone that chastens both her style and her sensibility, for in truth, together with all those fine qualities, there has been always traceable in Vernon Lee's work an unaffected sense of great problems, of the real probation of men and women in life, of a great pity, of the sad story of humanity, bringing now and again into her exposition of what is sometimes perhaps decadent art a touch of something like Puritanism. 18 Pater's choice of gerund phrase, bringing into, represents Lee as inclusive and multiplicitous rather than contradictious, recasting her as a varied rather than a schizoid artist. Various was the term that she had applied to Sargent's occasionally self-conflicting perspective and double nature, which she traced back to his exuberantly gifted, expressive, and Lebenslustige mother, on the one hand, and his Puritan, reserved and rather sternly dissatisfied father, on the other. In admonishing Sargent's critics, whom she accuses of having seen only one side at a time of his many-sidedness and the complexity of his genius, Lee appears covertly to plead for leniency for her vain self, in whom she claimed Sargent secretly expected to discover his equal and twin, in the sister art of letters. 19 Like the age to which it responded, Lee's was a complex genius, involving, as she had written of her mother's personality, a mass of contradictions, but these were all grown into each other, made organic and inevitable by her passionate and unmistakable individuality which recognized no law but its own. 20. Her reproach of Ruskin for his Catholicity might be said to serve as an apologia of the contrarieties what she might have preferred to view as the inevitabilities of her aesthetic sensibility. In Ruskinism, the would-be study of a conscience, included in Belcaro, she takes Ruskin to task for recoiling from the irrefutable fact that the beautiful to whose study and creation he was so irresistibly drawn, had no moral value, that in the great battle between good and evil, beauty remained neutral, passive, serenely egotistic. 21 Ruskin's failing, in her view, was that it was necessary for him that beauty should be more than passively innocent, he must make it actively holy. 22 As James had argued that questions of art are questions, in the widest sense, of execution, questions of morality are quite another affair, an attitude, perhaps, that explains his restrained response singular most curious nauseating, but how quite inexpressibly significant to the special vileness that, as John Buchan notes, the two men encountered when asked to examine some of the skeletons in the Byron family closet, and as Wilde had insisted that the fact of a man being a poisoner is nothing against his prose, the domestic virtues being incapable of serving as the true basis of art, so Lee believed that what was beautiful need not conduce to what was morally good any more than that which is ugly. The putrescent corpse and the murderer's face need be reprehensible. 23 She would go further, asserting that a morally delinquent artist was fully capable of rendering beautiful works of art. The materialistic, carnal Renaissance painter Perugino, she points out, produced estimable paintings. Sin and pain and injustice are realities, she concludes in a display of her romantically negative capabilities, and what is worse, they are necessities, they are not despite nature, but through nature, destructive forces perhaps, but which nature requires for her endless work of construction. And worse still, evil and good are not opponents, together they are knit in closest and most twisted bonds of cause and effect, bonds so close, so inextricably crossed and recrossed that severing one of them, tearing and cutting them asunder, it seems as if the whole universe would crash down upon us. Beauty is pure, complete, egotistic, it has no other value than its being beautiful. 24 Lee's insistence that what is beautiful may shape itself by virtue of its proximity to what is ugly and perverse does not override, however, the touch of Puritanism that colors her observations, prompting her at other points in the essay to shudder as, with reluctance, indeed, and sorrow, she acknowledges their regrettable, what is worse, truth. 25. In her expository writings Lee established a clear distinction between what she seems to have hoped aestheticism could entail and what she seems to have feared equally instinctively that it would become. In Renaissance fancies and studies, for example, she argued that even if beauty is united to perverse passions, and art, as with Baudelaire and the decadents, employed to adorn the sentiments of maniacs and jailbirds, the beauty and the art remain, and she urged in Gospels of Anarchy, 1908, as Yeats would do in his autobiographies, 1926, that art, like science itself, like philosophy, like every great healthy human activity, has a right to live and a duty to fulfill, quite apart from any help it may contribute to the enforcement of the moralist's teachings. 26. Her mouthpiece Baldwin, a character reminiscent of Wilde's Vivian in The Decay of Lying or Gilbert in The Critic as Artist, announces that an artist must be allowed absolute liberty of selection and treatment of subjects to the exclusion, he hastily adds, of all abnormal suggestion, of all prurient description, and of all pessimistic misrepresentation. 27. If Lee was unable to resolve these ceaselessly conflicting attitudes, however, she managed, in her fiction and more particularly in her horror stories, to make them more fully organic and inevitable by her unmistakable individuality which recognized no law but its own. Although they account for only about 1/4 of the entire body of her work, most of her fictions, and particularly her short prose narratives, for in both the form and the content of her work Lee often gravitated toward the minute, were written before 1905.28 year, as in nearly everything she said or wrote or thought, Lee expressed her determined notions both as to what degree of supernaturalism was appropriate and as to the relation of the supernatural to art itself so that only the orthodox reader of her stories would concur with Horace Gregory's assessment that ghosts are boldly listed in Vernon Lee's Dramatis Personae 29 as her master Pater liked to consider that a finer, more delicately marvelous supernaturalism existed in contrast to the crudity and coarseness of the two palpable intruders from a spiritual world in almost all ghost literature, in Scott and Shakespeare even, so Lee scoffed at the notion that genuine ghosts arise from the experiences of some Jemima Jackson, who 50 years ago, being 9 years of age, saw her maiden aunt appear 6 months after decease. 30. In the preface to Hauntings, she arranged traditional ghost stories that are about a nobody, that have no point or picturesqueness, and that are generally speaking, flat, stale, and unprofitable. 31. Such things, as she had argued nearly 20 years earlier in Belcaro, have less to do with the supernatural and the imagination than with a mistaken attempt to rationalize phenomena otherwise inexplicable. They represent abortive attempts to explain phenomena by causes with which they have no connection. 32. What use has the supernatural got? She flatly asked, if it land us in Islington or Shepherd's Bush. 33. The perception of the genuinely ghostly, Lee believed, required an additional sense evolving out of the effect on the imagination of certain external impressions, she wrote, that had been brought to a focus, personified, but personified vaguely, in a fluctuating ever-changing manner, the personification being continually altered, reinforced, blurred out, enlarged, restricted by new series of impressions from without. 34. In other words, the supernatural had something to do with the lie of the land, with the sensations, the impressions, and the symbols suggested by the spirit of places and the spirit of things, and, more essentially, with the extent to which such spurious ghosts haunted certain brains, engendering in them things of the imagination, born there, bred there, sprung from the strange confused heaps, half rubbish, half treasure, which lie in our fancy, heaps of half-faded recollections, of fragmentary vivid impressions, litter of multicolored tatters, and faded herbs and flowers, whence arises that odor, we all know it, musty and damp, but penetratingly sweet and intoxicatingly heady, which hangs in the air when the ghost has swept through the unopened door, and the flickering flames of candle and fire start up once more after waning. 35. As this Hawthornian passage suggests, it recalls, perhaps, the passage in the Custom House describing the genesis of the Scarlet Letter. The capacity to be haunted resides in an individual state of mind and requires some external stimulus and atmosphere, an image, the configuration of carefully selected words to trigger a series of impressions at once vaguely desirable and unsettling. Born of the imagination and its surroundings, the vital, the fluctuating, the potent, Lee's real supernatural involves a kind of Peyton exchange of external impression for internal awareness and sensation, and so for Lee could not be apprehended by means of the traditional Gothic formulas for evoking terror and pity, but instead required indirection, an unceasing shaping and reshaping of the creations of the fancy sponsored from without. 36. In The Lie of the Land, an essay included in Limbo, 1897, Lee expresses her desire to talk about something which makes the real, individual landscape the landscape one actually sees with the eyes of the body and the eyes of the spirit, the landscape you cannot describe. Convinced of the extreme one-sidedness of language and therefore doubtful of her ability to find a term that could embody her precise meaning, Lee refers to this landscape as an unnamed mystery into which various things enter, and these things make her feel as if she ought to explain herself by dumb show. 37. Although she portrays herself as rendered mute by a language insufficiently evolved to accommodate the rhythms and movements whose existence she intuits, she nevertheless succeeds, if Browning's sense of things in his inapprehensiveness is to be credited, in sketching a landscape invested with a mystery that, so far from unburdening the observer, thrusts various things into the field of vision. In his salutatory poem, a dialogue between two people who lament their inability to transcend mere sensory perception and to approach direct apprehension, Browning credits her with having the ability first to notice and then to describe the peculiar movements of wall-climbing plants, in short, with being able to discern and communicate not merely the look but the essence of things. In a tribute that he paid to Lee on the occasion of her death, Praz elucidates the evocative quality of Lee's art. Vernon Lee had, as few people have, a genius for unveiling the secret rhythm of the landscape, of an epoch, of a work of art. She liked to fix in a name, in an emblematic symbol, the uniqueness of her discoveries. 38. Both Browning and Praz fix on Lee's uncanny ability to capture the genius loci etrei, and their coincident terms of praise suggest that the two men conceived of her as sharing with the Impressionists and Symbolists what Simons described, in the context of decadence in art, as a desire to flash in a new, sudden way so exact an image of what you have just seen, just as you have seen it, that what is simultaneously flashed upon the soul is that which can be apprehended only by the soul, the finer sense of things unseen. 39. The sort of mystery that Lee sought to evoke, then, required ambiguity and indefinition, and becomes what Praz describes as a continual speculation in delicate hues. 40. Lee asserts in Faustus and Helena that although the two would appear to be closely allied, the supernatural is fundamentally antithetical to art, for the former is necessarily essentially vague, and art is necessarily essentially distinct. Give shape to the vague and it ceases to exist. 41. The image of the ibis on the amulet, or the owl on the terracotta, is more provocative than that of the Venus de Milo, not because the idea of divinity is more compatible with an ugly bird than with a beautiful woman, but because the former, Lee argued, allows the mind to wander off in the contemplation of the vague. 42. Define too precisely the nature of the uncanny, the horrific, the mysterious, she suggests, and one trivializes them, removing them from the realm of what could Be to that which is, the familiar, the inevitable, as James had chosen to characterize the real. James shared this view of the supernatural, suggesting that so long as the events are veiled, the imagination will run riot and depict all sorts of horrors, but as soon as the veil is lifted, all mystery disappears. 43 Necessarily enwrapped in mystery, the supernatural depends for its full effect for its very existence upon symbol and impression, on the dumb shows that Lee herself viewed as necessary if she were to be successful in capturing the lie of the land as she perceived it. Not surprisingly, then, when a critic had compared A Phantom Lover, 1886, an early story that would later reappear in Hauntings as Okefenokee, to Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, she is said to have bristled and pointedly distinguished her own story as very much better, although she qualified her judgment by asserting that her own sympathies did not lie with the prosaic, unpicturesque kind of supernatural. 44. By what means, then, does Lee manage to avoid the prosaic kind of supernatural and conjure up, in her own supernatural stories, what she recalled having once stumbled upon in the house of Pilate Church, a vague terror and sorrow that was genuinely terrible to our ancestors and terrible but delicious to ourselves, skeptical posterity. 45. Taking the stories that she wrote between the years 1890 and 1899 as evidence of her evolving sense of what constituted the picturesquely supernatural, we can say that Lee came to rely more heavily upon the florid prose style to which she had been drawn since the earliest years of her career. The style of the Italian poet and novelist Gabriele D'Annunzio, for example, whose writings at one point earned him a reputation as a perverter of public morals, served, in Lee's estimation, to establish the interconnection between syntax, diction, sentence length, and emotion. In the handling of words, Lee suggests that the power of D'Annunzio's prose resides in the suggestive sinuosities of his long, Latinized sentences, where adjectives are rare and verbs vague language that in turn delineates rictal horrors, an impression of something empty, featureless, gaping, but irresistibly emphatic. Eerie and tragic, which allows one to read the most revolting or preposterous stories without, as one otherwise would, disbelieving in their possibility outside a madhouse. 46. Although adjectives are hardly a rarity in Lee's own style, during her most prolific period as a writer of supernatural stories she sought to correlate language and content, style, and meaning, as she perceived the stylists she admired Pater and D'Annunzio to have done. More specifically, she saw that language could be used to evoke and hint at, rather than name and fix, ideas and moods, thus allowing the reader's mind to wander off in contemplation of the vague. Lee's language, rich and evanescent, stops just short of clarifying exact meanings and instead creates a kind of vacuum that would be filled, so she imagined, with what the ideally sympathetic reader would bring to her work. In her early stories, Lee approximated the picturesque in a prose style that seemed to her critics to be dangerously overwrought. The American novelist and translator Harriet Waters Preston, for example, described it as a sort of riotous verbiage and eager habit of iteration and reiteration. Van Wyck Brooks, in turn, wrote of Lee's strange fragments of human experience bearing with them odors and evanescent hues and curious forms, and Burdett Gardner discovered an unhealthy excess of color and jeweled ornament, a style bedecked in ormolu, his characterization casting him in the role of the uninstructed reader who, as Simons had much earlier warned Lee, might feel himself in a thick, luxuriant wood, and long for a little more definiteness. Point 47. The conjunction of form and content which in turn tropes the external and the internal, the spoken and the unspeakable, the physical and the psychic conducts and condenses the unwholesome weirdness that is a locus of the picturesque in Lee's stories. Thus, the lush descriptions of Venetian gardens are treated as being as likely a source of the vagaries of the young composer of A Wicked Voice, 1890, as are the offended sensibilities of the ghostly castrato who haunts him. In the material opacity of the story's prose, evident in its descriptions of morbid atmosphere and images of decomposition and decay, place and mind coalesce, the latter shaped by impressions and apprehensions drawn from the surroundings to which it is seamlessly joined. The narrator is haunted not merely by the castrato's voice, but also by the miasmic Venetian landscape, from which he had originally sought inspiration for the composition of his opera Ogier the Dane, but which instead contributes to, and is in turn reflected in, its fevered imaginings. He writes that beneath the dreamy splendor of noontide, Venice seemed to swelter in the midst of the waters, exhaling, like some great lily, mysterious influences, which make the brain swim and the heart faint, a moral malaria, distilled, as I thought, from those languishing melodies, those cooing vocalizations which I had found in the musty music books of a century ago. Later, he blames the failure of his attempts to write his opera on Venice itself, for it had merely put all my ideas into hopeless confusion. It was as if there arose out of its shallow waters a miasma of long-dead melodies, which sickened but intoxicated my soul. I lay on my sofa watching that pool of whitish light, which rose higher and higher, little trickles of light meeting it here and there, wherever the moon's rays struck upon some polished surface, while huge shadows waved to and fro in the draught of it. Open balcony. 48. Shot through with color, one encounters the painted image of a goddess in lemon and lilac draperies, foreshortened over a great green peacock. 210. Sound. The narrator is beset by little, sharp, metallic, detached notes and a voice, very low and sweet, that fills a room with an exquisite vibrating note, of a strange, exotic, unique quality. 210. And smell. A heavy, sweet smell, reminding him of the flavor of a peach. 210. Assails the narrator, who in turn dreams a very strange dream in which he is stifled by air laden with the scent of all manner of white flowers, faint and heavy in their intolerable sweetness. 208. The self-conscious materiality of the language of A Wicked Voice blankets the contours of the narrator's psychic landscape, which in its turn shapes itself referentially in response to external stimuli. The emphasis on color and form and sound and scent, the genius REI are to Lee's reader what the opaque atmosphere of Venice the genius loci is to the narrator of her story. A Wicked Voice is of particular interest because, as the revision of one of her earliest ghost stories, Winthrop's Adventure, 1881, it allows one to trace Lee's gravitation toward the decadence of her age, evident, if in nothing else, in her pastaging of the distinctive features of the late 19th century decadent. Idiom. 49. Both stories concern the experience of an artist who is haunted by the ghost of a dead 18th century singer. In the earlier story, the narrator tells us about Julian Winthrop, an odd, fantastic, impressionable artist devoted to no particular genre or method of art because he is possessed of too ungovernable a fancy, and too uncontrollable a love of detail, to fix and complete any impression in an artistic shape. 51. Afternoon at the villa of his friend Countess S., Winthrop hears an obscure air that, with its exquisitely finished phrases, its delicate vocal twirls and spirals, its symmetrically ordered ornaments, 146, agitates him. He explains that some years earlier he had discovered a portrait of an 18th century Italian singer, Ferdinando Rinaldi, who holds in his beautiful plump, white, blue-veined hand a sheet of music. The title of the work is Sei Regina, Io Pastor Sono, 163, and Maestro va Diasis, the collector who owns the portrait, describes it as a typical trunk air. Winthrop's obsession with the history of the singer with the yearning, half-pained look is enhanced both by his desire to hear the melody, the painted notes are unintelligible, and the score itself, va Diasis claims, is lost, and by his knowledge that the singer had been murdered after receiving too great notice. From a lady in high favor at court, 166. Winthrop eventually winds up at the villa where Rinaldi was assassinated, and, during the evening of his stay in the abandoned building, he hears the elusive tune sung by someone who looks at him with deep, soft, yearning eyes. 198. As one might expect, it is the spectral Rinaldi. Although Lee leaves open the possibility that Winthrop's ungovernable fancy explains his ghostly vision, the tale is still a fairly straightforward example of the sort of ghost story produced by Lee's precursors by J. Sheridan L. E. Fanu or Dickens, for example. The narrator of A Wicked Voice is also an artist and aspiring Wagnerian composer who, in post-fashion, is driven by ungovernable passions. He is haunted, so he believes, by a singer, the castrato Balthasar Ciceri, apparently because he, the narrator, has vilified singers as defiles of music who corrupt neoclassical heroic harmonies with their romantic voluptuous phrases and florid cadences. 216. Although the plot, in its broad particulars, is essentially the same in both versions, the revision chronicling a journey that is at once a confession, an exploration of horror, and a descent into madness depends for its effects upon narrative and stylistic features that create the sort of uncanniness typical of both fin de siècle, decadence and the traditional tale of horror. Unlike Winthrop, who could not forget the yearning face of his dead singer, the narrator of A Wicked Voice is haunted not by the dead singer Ciceri, called Zaffarino because he possesses a sapphire engraved with Kabbalistic signs presented to him one evening by a masked stranger. 199, a detail that reminds us that Lee shared an interest in fin de siècle diabolism with contemporaries such as Aleister Crowley and Arthur Machen, but by his voice and by the melody for which he was famous, the aria dei Meriti. The strains of this husband's air tyrannize over him, preventing the completion of his own opera, Ogier the Dane, the legendary knight who was held in thrall by an enchantress. Scorning not music but the sound of a human voice because the voice is but the beast calling, awakening that other beast sleeping in the depths of mankind, the beast which all great art has ever sought to chain up, as the archangel chains up, in old pictures, the demon with his woman's face. 198, the narrator finds himself desiring the very thing that, consciously, at least, most repulses him. The haunting sound of Zaffarino's voice becomes his inspiration, and he awaits its coming as a lover awaits his beloved. O wicked, wicked voice, violin of flesh and blood made by the evil one's hand, may I not even execrate thee in peace, but is it necessary that, at the moment when I curse, the longing to hear thee again should parch my soul like hell thirst? And since I have satiated thy lust for revenge, since thou hast withered my life and withered my genius, is it not time for pity? May I not hear one note, only one note of thine, O singer, O wicked and contemptible wretch? 237. The cry of frustrated longing with which A Wicked Voice concludes recalls Dorian's troubled response when, casting about for a comparative that will capture the seductive quality of his mentor's discourse, he settles on music, sweet as that of viol or of lute, whereas Lord Henry in his turn imagines that the terribly enthralling pleasure of talking to Dorian is akin to what would follow from his playing upon an exquisite violin, the music of passion being the answer it would make to every touch and thrill of it. Bow. 51. All three passages represent pure melody, pure art as subverting what is sensuous, erotic, bestial. The motif of music as the veiled expression of sublimated, often homoerotic desire occurs in a number of Lee's stories. It is to be found as well in a number of late 19th century horror stories. We encounter it, for example, in John Mead Faulkner's The Lost Stradivarius, 1895, in which the narrator's brother is destroyed by the music that he draws from a rare Stradivarius that had once belonged to a worshipper of occult mysteries, and in Oliver Onions' The Beckoning Fair One, 1911, whose protagonist's sanity is forfeited to the music of a harp played by a phantom woman. Abstract and largely anti-representational, music expresses itself entirely through form, but from the point of view of form, as Wilde understood, music is the type of all the arts. 52. Moreover, the cadences, movements, intonations, and harmony substitute textually for the otherwise unspeakable desire of the body. Lee treats music in A Wicked Voice not merely as a prototypical art form, but also as a metaphor for the aestheticism to which she was fiercely devoted but under the spell of which she feared she might fall too completely. Yet, the fact that Zaffarino's artistry is not merely erotically charged but fatal. His first song could make any woman turn pale and lower her eyes, the second make her madly in love, while the third song, presumably the aria dei Meriti, could kill her off on the spot, kill her for love, there under his very eyes, if he only felt inclined. 202, complicates the reading that would interpret the narrator's anguished peroration to A Wicked Voice as, to borrow John Clute's characterization, the mutilating savagery of Lee's own refusal of the haunting licentiousness of art. The sexual aggression that one encounters in A Wicked Voice is a curiously recurring thematic motif in Lee's corpus, and although it is not always rendered metaphorically as music, it is almost always feminized, manifested by versions of the despotic femme fatale and destroying bitch goddesses beloved of the decadence. Thus, the duplicitous Medea de Carpi, an infamous figure of 16th century Urbanian history, lures the naive Professor Spyro Trek of Amurdur, 1890, into a madness reminiscent of that which follows upon the fawning affections of the brutish feminine spectre who dogs the misogynistic professor of Robert Higgins's How Love Came to Professor Gildia, 1900. The title character of Lee's The Virgin of the Seven Daggers, 1889, is an effigy of a 16th century Spanish Madonna for whom the only sufficient devotional offering or sacrifice is the head of her cavalier worshipper, the debauched Don Juan. With her skirts that bulge out in melon-shaped folds, all damascate with minute heart's ease, and brocade with silver roses, she is a baroque version of Parvati, Mount Hip love goddess of the luscious fancy of the Brahmin, to whom Merimi, the narrator of Shiel's Zilusha, 1896, compares the title character, whom he envisions in the redundance of her decollete development Zilusha, the feminine. Zilusha recalling the splendid harlots of history. Expert as Dargelia, cultured as Aspasia, purple as Semiramis. 54. The jeweled language what Blyler calls the elaborate word lapidarism of Merimi's experience with Zilusha is paradigmatic of the reader's covertly lecherous experience with the decadent text, which often features protagonists whose lusts are inflamed and not cooled in the chill of the grave. 55. This stylistic Ormolu also functions as an analog to the demonic Zilusha herself, who is identified with the abnormal beauty of artifice and hyper-refinement conducive, however paradoxically, to a corruption that expresses itself organically. Gamey and marbled with corruption is the descriptive that Gautier assigns to it. Decadent style. Point 56. In this respect, Shields' solution exemplifies what critics such as Remy G. Sayes-Ellen and Ray Beth Gordon have cited as the damning, and otherwise unlikely, identification of femininity with ornament and the decorative in Western culture, an association characteristic of the writing of late 19th century decadents and aesthetes, literally rather than metaphorically expressed in Lord Henry's assertion that women are a decorative sex. Point 57. Lee's otherwise curiously straightforward engagement with the masculine desire to control and contain the perceived threat embodied in the wig-wiglet, the eternal feminine engagement exemplified in the excess of idiom of which she continually avails herself in the body of her work, is further complicated when one considers her description of the despotic Zaffarino, who is said to possess an effeminate, fat face almost beautiful, with an odd smile, brazen and cruel, the likes of which the narrator remembers encountering only in Swinburne and Baudelaire, whose works, he says, were characterized by the faces of wicked, vindictive women, a wicked voice. 206. The suggested textual politics of Lee's story are aggravated, not reinforced, however, by the fact that Zaffarino is not a femme fatale, not the impressionable and melancholic Alice Oakhurst, not the femme fille who is the snake lady to whom Prince Alberic betroths himself, not the femme sorcière who is Dione, the young Eastern girl of exotic beauty whom the narrator takes to be a fatal incarnation of Venus. Rather, he is a castrato, an explicitly feminized man who, in taking his place among the feminized male protagonists, who are identified with love of artifice, excess, and everything unnatural, by extension connects Lee herself with the cadre of male European avant-garde authors whose writings blur culturally determined distinctions regarding gender and class. Rita Felsky suggests that the apparently erotic subversion of gender norms, typical of this genre, which is conventionally interpreted as creating a counter-discourse of symbolic resistance to the commodification and technical rationality of modern capitalism, in fact reinscribes more insistently the divisions that the text ostensibly calls into question, revealing deep-seated anxieties about both gender and class, although it would appear to be part of a larger destabilization of conceptions of authenticity and a critical response to the presentation of bourgeois values and beliefs as rooted in an organic and unchanging reality. 58. In assuming such contradictory attitudes and models of expression, Lee positions herself squarely in the midst of the decadence of her age, its apparently conflictive variability providing just as Lee's did its only true consistency. Perversity is embedded in and framed by perversity in such stories of hers as A Wicked Voice or The Virgin of the Seven Daggers, both of which serve, as Gardner notes, as prime examples of the sort of writing which brought the reproach of decadence on the Yellow Book, a publication with which Lee was in any event affiliated, her Prince Alberic and the Snake Lady having appeared in the 10th volume in July of 1896.59, and like the Yellow Book, the existence of which was so brief, Lee's excursion into an embattled engagement with decadence did not long survive the century's close. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, in fact, she had for the most part left off writing unlikely stories altogether, perhaps because she felt increasingly that the very writing of them was a self-indulgent as well as a self-incriminating pastime, perhaps because this particular mode of writing had itself become decadent, the subject of parody or satire. In any case, the change enabled her to focus her considerable energies on the study of literary psychology, and when she returned to her old themes nearly 3 decades after the turn of the century, Lee turned to something like Henry James's emphasis on a deeper psychology, abandoning her Ormolu in favor of a more chastened description of the solitary image, evoked in a title that seems to promise very little. Yet in The Doll, the fifth of the 5 unlikely stories contained in the collection entitled For Maurice, 1927, she succeeds in creating her briefest, her most complex, her most uncanny, and perhaps her best story. Although its chaste simplicity of structure and tone would seem to indicate that Lee was seeking not merely to transcend the consciously artificial style of her decadent years, a style recalled in the 4 other unlikely stories of For Maurice, but to purge her art of its incriminating aestheticism, The Doll represents the culmination of all she had learned in the course of her excursions into decadence and the supernatural. It therefore takes its otherwise unlikely place in this consideration of fin de siècle horror because it revisits, reconsiders, and in a sense exorcises the unresolved issues that are covertly present in the style and structure of the other tales of the volume, among them, Winthrop's Adventure, which had their genesis in an earlier phase of a career that may be said to have prepared her for the writing of The Doll. Gone are the phantom voices, the crazed narrators, the murky atmospheres, the visions, the tormenting pagan goddesses, those defining markers of fin de siècle horror, the absence of which was apparently sufficient to persuade Blyler to refrain from commenting on the tale in his guide to supernatural fiction, other than to pronounce it not supernatural, a judgment with which Jessica Amanda Samuelson implicitly takes issue in her decision to include it in her anthology of feminist supernatural fiction. What did Miss Darrington see? 60. Yet, the absence of conventional ghosts does not dilute the general uncanniness of The Doll. The story begins with a faceless and nameless narrator who recalls for her auditor, apparently a close female friend, the circumstances surrounding her discovery in Italy of a life-size mannequin. The narrator tells her confidant that while on one of her bric-a-brac journeys in search of antiquities, she took up residence at a small inn in Foligno, Umbria, where she met a delightful curiosity dealer whose Christian name was Orestes and who shared her passion for beautiful things. And for the past in general. 61. 3 days before the narrator was to depart, Orestes informed her that a local nobleman wished to sell his collection of Chinese plates. Orestes persuaded her to view them, if only so that they might thereby gain entry to the late 17th century palace, grandiose, but very coarse, in which the plates were housed. While wandering through the rooms of the palace, she encountered a beautiful, finely made, and life-size figure of a woman, dressed in the costume of the 1820s, which had been brought to the housekeeper's room for its annual dusting and which is, the housekeeper claimed, the first wife of the Count's grandfather. Some time later, Orestes cautiously touched on the subject of the object's strange life, revealing that the old Count, after the death of his beautiful child bride, had ordered that a doll should be made in her image. Clothed in her very dress, her silk stockings, her sandal shoes, her silk mittens, and her own hair, which had been made into a wig that fit over the cardboard head, the doll had been placed in the dead woman's chamber, where the old Count had spent hours with it each day. Gradually, however, his interest waned, his visits grew fewer and eventually ceased altogether, and following his death, the doll was exiled to an obscure corner, from whence it was finally rescued by the new Count's housekeeper, who brought the doll to her own room, where she dusted and admired it, because it must have cost a lot of money and because its model had been a real lady. 220. Although she was eager to leave Foligno, the narrator found herself preoccupied with the story of the doll, whose fate, she came to imagine, rested with her. She persuaded Orestes to negotiate on her behalf with the new Count for the purchase of the doll and, having secured her, conveyed her in a closed carriage to Orestes' shop, behind which was a garden that looked out on the Umbrian mountains. There, they placed the effigy upon a heap of kindling of myrtle and bay, and lighted the pyre with a burning pine cone. As the small Holocaust subsided, the narrator discovered among the ashes a wedding band, a precursor, perhaps, of that which the speaker of Sylvia Plath's Lady Lazarette discovers in the midst of the ash that she pokes and stirs, flesh, bone, there is nothing there, and, at the urging of Orestes, kept it, thus concluding her tenure as a collector. Just as Foligno was the site of St. Francis of Assisi's renunciation of material possessions, so her experience in the Umbrian village put her out of conceit with ferreting about among dead people's properties. 209, perhaps because she perceived in herself a version of the irresistible desire common, as Nordau insisted, among degenerates who accumulate useless trifles and aimless bric-a-brac, which does not become any more useful or beautiful by being called biblos, or perhaps, because she discerned in her rage for collecting a rage of a different order of magnitude. 62. The doll takes pride of place among the effigies, stone idols, marionettes, and puppets littering the lumber room and enchanted garret of Lee's imagination. References to dolls, effigies, puppets abound in her writings and therefore in the studies or commentaries of her work written by her friends and critics. Lee's friend Maurice, bearing the Maurice of, for Maurice referred in his memoirs, for example, to the Italian effigies, dolls, puppets between whose world and are only acted as a mediatrix. 63 in her first major critical endeavor, Lee herself charted the history of the 18th century Italian commedia dell'arte tradition, with chapters titled The Comedy of Masks, Goldoni and the Realistic Comedy, and Carlo Gozzi and the Venetian Fairy Comedy, all concerned with such figures as Pantalone, Harlequin, and Cassandrino, characters behind whose masks are live actors whose sole art, Lee stressed, consisted in having none, in being real. 64 3 years after the publication of her studies, Lee wrote a fairy story, The Prince of the Hundred Soups, which was, as its subtitle indicates, a puppet show in narrative. 65 The costumed and bewigged icon of the Virgin of the Seven Daggers precedes the dolls and effigies featured in at least 4 of the 7 stories collected in a volume of Lee's work entitled Popeches and Other Fantastic Tales, 1904, which includes a protagonist who is transformed into a stone idol in the title story, Prince Alberich. With its reference to the debauched Duke's hairdresser's block, The Lady and Death, in which 2 wooden manikins representing Saint Theodulus and the Devil are locked in combat, The Featureless Wisdom, in which 3 finely carved effigies of Athena play a central role, and Saint Eudaimon and his orange tree, featuring an unearthed statue of Venus. Lee's contemporaries shared her obsession with creative automata, which they tended to view as their own creations. Always make your man before you make your surrounding. In spite of the Book of Genesis urged Gordon Craig in The Mask, his turn of the century journal of puppetry. Automaton immortality was treated as being less conditional than that even of the immortals. It is an incontestable and undisputed fact, wrote a contributor to The Mask, that the puppets survived the gods. 66 Its actions ritualized and contrived, the creative automaton is less susceptible to decay than is the animated nature that it mimics and mocks. Writing in 1897 to his friend Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham, Conrad announced that marionettes were beautiful because their impassibility in loving crime, in mirth, in sorrow is heroic, superhuman, fascinating. I never listened to the text mouthed somewhere out of sight by invisible men who are here today and rotten tomorrow, he wrote. I love the marionettes that are without life, that come so near to being immortal. 67 Conrad's passing allusion to what is rotten renames the instability that characterizes Jean Baudrillard's description of the simulacrum as a liquidation of all referentials, which are artificially resurrected in the systems of signs. 68 In the case of the sort of funerary effigy represented in Lee's story, this liquidation grows out of the anxious response to the material body's imminent liquefaction, one of the vicissitudes that Baudrillard notes the simulacrum short circuits. 2. The ideal funerary monument, Lee's doll serves as an incorruptible substitute for the decomposing body of the dead woman. It is the idealized portrait that denies or temporarily effaces the presence of death and thus offsets any anxiety that the living suffer in contemplating their own mortality, made palpably manifest in the body's dissolution following death. In subjecting the human form to what Simons described as the over-subtilizing refinement upon refinement characteristic of literary decadence, the funerary effigy transforms the destabilized body whose volatile corporeality and imminent dissolution it includes into an ideal of death in life and life in death, gathering it instead into Yeats's Artifice of Eternity. 69 It serves simultaneously, however, as a memento mori, a reminder of death and a variant of the classical skeleton at the feast tradition, to which we have already referred, according to which invited guests at a banquet pass from hand to hand a corpse image called, among other names, a cadaverina. With their jointed heads, arms and legs especially designed to represent a lifeless body, these gloomy convivial marionettes served as a commentator for the mask notes, either as a poor jest of the worst kind or else as an incentive to the practical propaganda of Epicureanism. 70-some-odd blend of jest and egotism, for example, very probably informed Jeremy Bentham's decision to have his own body, upon his death, filled out with straw, dressed in his clothes, and transformed into an entity that was, according to the terms of his will, to be brought out each year to preside over a meeting held on Founders' Day at University College in London, where it still sits enclosed in a glass case during the remainder of the year. Bentham was also the author of a curious work entitled Auto-Icon, or Farther Uses of the Dead to the Living 1842, but his attempt to transform himself into his own memorial statue, the process involved embalming and the use of caoutchouc and shellac, was not altogether successful, for his head decayed and was eventually replaced with one made of wax, and the original was placed between his feet. That his preserved self should through his own head's unruliness thus betray itself as a mixture of dissimilar parts is not surprising, but serves rather as a piquantly perverse, and, what is better, unvarnished, expression of the essentially conflictive quality of all simulacra, each of which is by nature, as well as by art, an interfusion of unlike parts. It is perhaps worth reminding ourselves that the doll appears in a collection subtitled 5 Unlikely Stories. In its own way as monstrous as the homunculus in de la Mere's A, B, O, the heterogeneous simulacrum often interacts perniciously with those that come into contact with its unruly body, which is the embodiment of the object, the paradoxically fixed yet irreparable locus at which borders are dissolved and oppositions and contrarieties fused. Maurice Roland's admission in L.E. Maniac, I always shudder at the strange look of some boot or some shoe, and suddenly, on thinking of the foot they cover, I ask myself, is it mechanical, or living, suggests that for him not the body itself, but merely one of its displaced appurtenances was required if he were to experience a version of the frisson that E.T.A. Hoffman had taught his followers, or those, at least, who frequented waxwork museums, to recognize as the oppressive sense of being in the presence of something unnatural and gruesome, a sense itself originating in the instinctive knowledge that the puppet that looks alive might in fact be alive, and clustered among these interlocutory texts is the single black-heeled pump, accessorized with lace and an artificial rose, featured in the 10th of the 18 photographs in which the artist Hans Belmer documented the Life of a sculptured doll, descendant of Hoffmann's Olympia, figure 30.71. Das Unheimlich is the now overtaxed term that Freud assigned to that oppressive sense of anxiety and to the doubts generated by the unlikely question of whether an apparently animate being waxwork figures, ingeniously constructed dolls and automata might be really alive, or conversely, whether a lifeless object might not be in fact animate. 72. The doubts that Lee's narrator sustains in relation to the doll originate not in the uncanny likeness it bears to its predecessor but in its treatment as a living being, for none of the story's characters differentiate between the Countess and her effigy. Elaborating on Sally Humphreys' observation that while the living body is associated with individuality, death threatens to put an end to differentiation, Brenven argues that the corpse is a figure without any distinguishing facial traits of its own, and one could say that semiotically it serves as an arbitrary, empty, interchangeable sign, an interminable surface for projections. 73. Lee's story, however, resists what both critics identify as the semiosis of the cultural representations of the dead woman, for the Countess is represented as having enjoyed no greater degree of individuation in life than her memorialized body does in death. In filling so integrally the gap left by the death of the lady, Lee's doll suggests that, in life, the living Countess was perceived as though she were in it, a dead object worthy of being loved just as a doll is in it that is treated as though it were a she, her associates as blind to the essential differences between the living and the dead as the artist represented in Jean Weber's The Puppets, 1900, beside whom lies sprawled the naked body of a woman as passively immobile as the doll's upon which the artist's attention is fixed, figure 31. It is the doll's ability to efface the distinction between literal and figural to assume, as Freud would have it, the culturally legitimized functions and meanings of the object it embalms and pacifies that so profoundly disturbs the narrator of Lee's story. Yet although the narrator recognizes an essential disjuncture between form and essence, like the lady's earlier associations, for whom her face and form bear in death precisely the same contours that they assumed when animate, she of necessity reads her own meanings into the idealized portrait that presents itself to her view. The fact that she does so emphasizes cultural assumptions about a woman's inability to exercise any semblance of control over the meanings assigned to her, particularly in her aestheticized condition as art object, the various incarnations of which include, as Susan Goodbar notes, the ivory carving or mud replica, an icon, or doll 74. The degree to which nearly all of the story's characters including the sympathetic narrator control and articulate the terms of the lady's humanity is made manifest in a scene in which the housekeeper manipulates the doll and positions her, bending the articulated arms, and crossing one leg over the other beneath the white satin skirt. While begging the old witch to desist, the narrator watches fascinated as one of the poor feet continues dangling and wagging dreadfully, 216. This is the first of the only two instances in which Lee invokes the word articulate in relation to the doll. The second passage describes her condition in life as an inarticulate one, the consequence of her having been married, straight out of the convent, to a man who never showed any curiosity as to whether his idol might have a mind or a character of her own, 217-18. His behavior is, presumably, determined by his expectations, among which quietness would figure as one of the preeminent merits of women while the opposite demerit of a tongue too loud, too ready, or too importunate in its exertions, as Sarah Stickney Ellis taught her readers to recognize, was objectionable universally condemned by members of a nobler sex who were contented to find in woman what Edward Carpenter would many years later attempt to teach the readers of his Love's Coming of Age, 1896, to recognize as an emblem of possession a mere doll, an empty idol, a brag of man's exclusive right in the sex. 75. Quietness, or silence, and obedience are, not surprisingly, the two distinguishing virtues out of which springs what Gordon Craig designated as chief among the marionette's virtues, namely, the humility that, if it is only an assumption in men, is particularly so in the living actor, who, Arthur Symons alleged, even when he condescends to subordinate himself to the requirements of pantomime, has always what he is proud to call his temperament, in other words, this intrusive little personality of his. 76. Thus, the actress Eleonora Duse insisted that, because they poison the air of the theater and make its drama impossible, actors and actresses must all die of the plague, whereas Gordon Craig suggested, somewhat less apocalyptically, that the theater might be saved merely by installing in place of flesh and blood actors whose bodies are by nature utterly useless as a material for an art paper marionette, a life-sized puppet that constituted the ideal actor, the actor plus fire, minus egoism, the lateral liability of the theater to which Craig, as the son of the legendary actress Ellen Terry and the architect William Godwin, would have had a good deal of exposure. Point 77. Its traits allow the marionette to respond to an indication without reserve or revolt, to be trained to perfection, and to content himself with waiting anywhere for any length of time, hidden in a box, in a cellar or even in a century. But he will wait, and when he is brought forward and made to feel at home he will still wait, and he waits upon you and all of us like a true servant. 78. Impressed with the passive, remote, impersonal, and automaton-like nature of the marionette as it fruitlessly confronted the forces of destiny, Maurice Maeterlinck wrote his three dramas for puppets, Aladdin et Palomides, Interreur, and La Mort de Tintagels, 1894. Recognizing that it is not nature that one looks for on the stage but what is elusive in the illusion of this kind of spectacle, Symons lauded the marionettes for whom /which the playwright had conceived of his plays, discerning in these inspired pieces of painted with the perfect medium between the meaning of a piece, as the author conceived it, and that other meaning which it derives from an audience's reception of it. Max Beerbohm in his turn speculated that puppets are better suited to convey the artfulness of nature, one hardly believing that anyone but a marionette ever lived in the midst of stylized settings. Point 79. The salient differences in their respective situations might otherwise undermine the likelihood that a dead countess could meaningfully be compared to the marionettes, whose lives are so suitably framed by a proscenium march. Even memorialized, as she is in death indeed, because she has been memorialized in death, the Countess is the perfect household icon, the ultimate art object and object of desire, sufficiently untraveled in the darker passages of the demi-monde but still possessing something of the erotic attraction of the elegant courtesan of haute prostitution, as though she were the most expensive of bibelots. Isolated from the world of business, the real world in which real men are at war with each other, and thus protected from the battle of the streets, which, according to Say Selin, exemplifies the male principle, what Mrs. Ellis called the potent, I had almost said the omnipotent consideration of worldly aggrandizement. Enshrined within a sanctified realm, and therefore fully hidden from view, the marionette would appear to be able to acclimate itself to any situation, since the defining features of its existence are exposure both through arrangement, the limp body of the doll invites intimate engagement, and through performance, the falsely animated body of the doll is wholly available to public view, and contrivance, the latter characteristic at odds with the organicist, natural principle that, throughout the 19th century was associated with the feminine principle. Point 80. Both art and women, as Velsky points out, were divorced from a work ethic and a reality principle, and both came increasingly to be seen as decorative, functionless, linked to the world of appearance and illusion, particularly if one considers the association between the decorative feminine and interior decorating, an appropriate avocation, as Saya Selin notes, for the middle-class woman otherwise excluded from the spheres in which true culture was carried forward and great art produced. The memorialized body of the woman perfects the room she adorns, serving as the ultimate example of the movable ornaments that the 19th century American romantic Harriet Prescott Spofford, in her discussion of bric-a-brac, saw as engrafting a life and vivacity upon what would frequently be but a dead dullness without them. 81. Moreover, the woman memorialized in death may be said to provide the occasion for, and even, as in the case of the marionette, the means by which a performance is carried forward. The Count in Lee's story spends hours every day weeping and moaning before 219, the dead image of his wife, his expressions of grief, which counterbalance his earlier effusions of love, requiring for their full effect an admiring audience, which would ideally consist of the object of the devotions in whose eyes one might read the mute gratitude that prostration so scrupulously performed would surely merit. Henry James's George Stransom deconstructs the motivations underlying the similarly obsequious devotions that he performs at the altar of his dead, and suspects that, although he had initially indulged himself in the belief that he was ministering to the needs of his departed friends, it was essentially in his own soul that the revival of the dead had taken place, and it was his presence that had made the indispensable medium. The dead, as he comes to understand, were witnesses to his secret rites in a way that the living could never duplicate, the strange life of the object being such that it cannot conceive, as Lee would elsewhere note, that it likes or dislikes anything done to it or said about it, its existence being entirely subject to the satisfaction and, often casually, cruel pleasure of another. Point 82. Thus, Maggie Tulliver keeps in the attic of the mill a large wooden doll whose head records a long career of vicarious suffering, the 3 nails that it sports commemorating as many crises in Maggie's 9 years of earthly struggle. 83. The tortuous affections that Elliot's heroine lavishes upon her fetish are an early, less intentionally murderous, if such is possible, version of those that the 14-year-old Giselle Prassinos would many years later imagine meeting out to the life-size doll that became the photographed subject of Hans Belmer's Die Pup, 1934. When I press her full cheeks with my hands, the real-life girl fantasized, a whitish liquid will run out of her mouth. There will be pink bubbles issuing from her nose. Then I will hug her very hard to the point of killing her blue eyes, to the point of giving them a life of my own. Her own desires, as she so well recognized, merely intersected those of the doll's maker. He wanted a big dead doll, to hold in his arms and stifle, she precociously announced, who had expressed his own desire to adjust the joints and arrange his doll in childlike poses so that once everything had been made pretty he might proceed ruthlessly to spill the salt of deformation. 84. Prassinos's desire to read in the blue eyes of her idol a life of my own is not fundamentally different, although the sadistic intent that informs it is more artlessly divulged than that of her contemporaries, of Belmer himself, for example, who remembers having described the body of his doll like a sentence that invites us to rearrange it, so that its real meaning becomes clear through a series of endless anagrams, and before him, of Simons, who begrudged the living actor his little intrusive personality, of the fictitious Stransom, who at length understands that it is his own light that blazes in the candles of his altar, and it is his own desire that he has read in the looks that survived long after the closed eyes of dead women had looked their last, and before these, of Browning's Duke, the dizzying proliferation of the eyes and mice of his monologue unveiling the true motivation behind his attempt to paint his Duchess's portrait in words. Point 85. Unervingly contradictiously among them all is Lee herself. In her admission, entered into her diary, that in the death of her friend and Meyer, she lost nothing or but little in the possible loss of the real Madame Meyer, for does there not remain, unchanged and unchangeable, the imagined one? She assures herself that one cannot lose the creature born of one's fancy and one's desires, the unreal, and the desires that she voices are inseparable from those she fell for, artificial ideal beings, who can never shift the moral light in which we see them, who can never turn round in their frames and say, see, we are not what you imagined. 86. Thus framed, such an idealized being can never be other than a devo amico desideratissimiss, a composite of the wishes and interests of another, and in this context it is perhaps worth recalling Lee's coy admission that the symbolically named Pierre Desiderio, whose surname expresses a desire for what is lost, was the one who dictated her story to her. What is in fact exhibited more or less explicitly in such devotionals is the power that supersedes the desire to possess, arrange, and articulate, a power that, in much 19th century writing, tended to define itself in textual terms in relation to the feminine, which, according to Mrs. Ellis, required the faculty of instrumentality, a cross-purpose term signaling an agency at once proactive and passively inclined, embodied in the ability to be used and to serve, without which women could aspire only to the condition of dead letters in the volume of human life, filling what would otherwise be a blank space, but doing nothing more. 87. However sensitized she may be to the fact that the idealized portrait is no less the object of a proprietary gaze, and made no less textuary a subject than its antecedent had been, Lee's narrator, in the process of recovering the doll's story, becomes a detached spectator as well, a role for which, as it turns out, she is well fitted by nature as well as by necessity. For a brief while she confounds both the woman and her effigy in her indiscriminate use of the pronoun she, and elsewhere she admits that she initially allowed no distinction between the portrait and the original, 217, even in retrospect she scarcely knows whether she ought to call it a thing, 209. Only later in her narrative does she make an effort to correct herself, as when she claims to have known, in her words, all about the doll when she was alive, I mean about the lady, 218, a provocative presumption of knowledge given that the doll is a cipher, silent, motionless, and figures in this respect as a type of the daughter of England who, according to Mrs. Ellis, would ideally comport herself as one who has nothing, and is nothing, of herself, whose experience, if unparticipated, is a total blank, who, in her inexhaustible sympathies, can live only in the existence of another. 88. Mrs. Ellis's construction of the feminine curiously resonates with what Adolf first, in his note on marionettes, later defined as the quintessence of the inanimate, proposing that it is this doing nothing, this saying nothing, this meaning nothing which raises the puppet to an altitude that is limitless. 89. Richly abundant, nothingness is, for Mrs. Ellis, inexhaustible, and full of potential, nothingness possesses, for first, limitless possibility. What is nothing, the feminine, the inanimate, is so wholly accommodating and so expansive in terms of what it can be made to contain that it eventually does away with itself in favor of what seeks to occupy its place. Such, as Baudrillard would come to represent it, is the vital function of the model in a system of death. In subsuming so completely the functions of the real, the model or simulacrum not only renders the real in which it originates redundant, but casts doubt on the plausibility of its ever having existed in the first place. Never again, Baudrillard assures his reader, will the real have the chance to produce itself, too, and we see here that in such a system of signs, one set of vital functions may substitute for another, less stable set. In this way, according to Baudrillard, the simulacrum or hyperreal threatens, assaults, and in the end destroys the charm of abstraction, which rests in the sovereign difference, too, between the true and the false, between the real and the imaginary. 3. Such, he concludes, is the murderous power of images. 5. And its phraseology hints at, although it avoids explicitly naming yet another paradox and unlikely good, the simulacrum must commit murder in order to efface death. Although irresistibly impelled, 217, as she says, to reconstruct the original story of the articulated woman, whatever Lively's narrator in the doll describes will not be peculiarly her subjects, for that is irrecoverable. She is likened both to an angry Madonna and to a Canova goddess, the comparative at once establishing generically and effacing the unique features of her face, not just as the divinities, whose mythologized lives are understood to have influenced the shape her own life has assumed, have themselves been purged. As Lee explained, of the vitality of the myths of paganism, the doll has been drained in a process endlessly recuperated, but slightly diminished with each successive irrigation. Point 90. In this respect the doll articulates in fictional terms an analysis that Lee had undertaken in those of her essays devoted to the cult of the Virgin, or Mariolatry, and it is perhaps worth noting in this context that the term marionettes, meaning little Marys, refers to the diminutive version sold by Venetian toy vendors of the Marioles or Marie de Legno wooden Marie or Marian Big Marys, pious images associated with the annual festival of the Marys, in which mechanical figures eventually came to substitute for the girls who, in the earliest years of the festival, were selected to represent 12 Venetian maidens who had been abducted by Barbary pirates, rescued, and then married. The puppets reenacting, that is, the narrative in which the Virgin is threatened with dishonor and then reclaimed, her sexuality ceded to the state of marriage. Although willing to concede that their descendants could stand as plausible substitutes for the antique gods and goddesses, for is Our Lady not the divine mother of gods as well as God, Demeter, or Mary, in whom the sad and ugly things of our bodily origin and nourishment are transfigured into the grace of the immortal spirit? Lee more regularly inveighed against the Christian doctrines that had facilitated a puritanic deprecation of whatever, throughout ages of greater faith, had survived of the antique gods and their jovial rites. Just as, for Lee, what was truly supernatural could not be regularized, defined, or explained, so the insufficiencies of the Christian supernatural system were due not to overwrought fancy, but to overtaxed reason. Christianity, born in an age of speculation and eclecticism, removed its divinities, its mystic figures, out of the cosmic surroundings of paganism. It forbade the imagination to touch or alter them. It regularized, defined, explained, placed the Savior, the Virgin, the saints, and angels, into a kind of supersensuous world of logic, adapted to heaven, and different therefore from the logic of earth, but logic none the less. 91. She charged the Congress of Men of Science who regulated the official Christianity with having banished any vagaries of the imagination which might show themselves in their mystical logic system, and thereby having extinguished the genuinely supernatural as well. Point 92. The supernatural is part of a larger engendering process, and to Lee it seemed that the myths of paganism derived their vitality from the unceasing shaping and reshaping of the fancy's creations, for the real supernatural is born of the imagination and its surroundings, the vital, the fluctuating, the potent. 93. She argued, too, that Christianity, and particularly its feminine ideal, had grown increasingly asexual. Although Mary evolved out of Hellenic culture, and although she might perform many roles, mother, queen, bride, courtly lady, she does so always as a virgin, as the Virgin, her in partu and perpetual virginity, what Michael P. Carroll points to as the defining feature of the Catholic Mary cult. Point 94. The ideal Victorian woman, having been created in the image of Mary, now an effective instrument of asceticism and female subjection, Marina Warner notes, acquired not only her humility and submissiveness, but also a sexuality that perversely defines her as perfectly chaste matron and mother. Point 95. Hence the popularity of the archetypal femme enfant portrayed in Abbot Henderson-Thayer's Virgin Enthroned, 1891, figure 32, or Thomas Gotch's The Child Enthroned, 1894, or Holy Motherhood, c. 1902. In the subject of each work, perfect juvenile chastity blends by degrees into serene maternal devotion. Lee suggests, however, that in having denied the Virgin, and by extension, the woman in whose image she was remade, the sexual powers that she had inherited from her pagan precursors, modernity had in fact deprived itself of genuine myth-making powers. As her commentary to her story featuring The Impaled Madonna makes clear, a bloodless, intellectualized sensibility requires an equally idealated divinity as the object of its devotions, a virgin dressed in a vast farthingale, her body cased like a knife in its sheath in a network of seed pearl, her face made of wax, white with black glass eyes and a tiny coral mouth, and in the little clearing made among the brocade and the seed pearl at her bosom, 7 gold-hilted knives. 96. This knife-riddled Spanish Madonna of the Counter-Reformation receives the devotions of a super-rake and super-ruffian, both united by common ancestry in the wickedness of man's imagination. 97. Threatening, savorless, enervating, truly decadent, she is akin to what Lee had elsewhere described as the fair dame in the velvet embroidered gown, with the long, hanging hair, the sister of that slyly sentimental coquette, the Mona Lisa of Leonardo, the counterpart of what Henry Adams, writing in 1900 in America, characterized as the monthly magazine-made American female who had not a feature that would have been recognized by Adam, all of them simulacra, of one sort or another. Their artificial bodies, the wax figure, the painted image, the illustration fixed on a page of a magazine retaining only the most superficial features, or shell, of the female body in whose very tissues, organismically speaking, they may be said to have been parthenogenetically conceived. Point 98. Not even so much as what is left to the Virgin of Venus's sexual power, although even in its diminished state, Adams considered it a force to be reckoned with, referring to it in The Dynamo and the Virgin, 1900, as the greatest and most mysterious of all energies remains to the central character of Lee's story, as rigidly encased in her culturally determined role as the daggered Virgin is in her farthingale. Point 99. Unable to mediate between the living and the dead, unequal to the task of negating the void it was created to fill, the doll can no more reciprocate the counsel of than could its unless one precursor, a mere shy, proud, inexperienced child who, until she lay dying in childbirth, at which point she escaped the thrall of the stupid, inconceivable incapacity for expressing her feelings, could not know what answer to make her husband's overflowing, garrulous, demonstrative Affection, although in a deep, inarticulate way she had really cared for him more than he cared for her. 217 to 18 An ominous prospect for the woman who attempts to deliver herself of her desire. Even the belief that as a household idol the doll possesses an icon's immortality proves illusory, for when the narrator encounters it, the satin white frock it wears has turned gray with ingrained dirt, its black fringed kerchief is almost red, its poor white silk mittens and white silk stockings are almost black, and even its wig is dusty, unkempt. 215, standing as brutal testimony that nothing survives the grave, not even artifice. In her final apocalyptic act, as I have noted, the narrator ritualistically burns the doll on a pyre of myrtle and bay, both symbolic of immortality. The narrator's devotions might be read as a ritualized purification, purging of veiled vision, veiled interaction, and the artistry that must in its turn fail within a disintegrating society that encases women in roles that efface the reality of their lives and require them instead to occupy a fixed space in which, as Teresa Dolores notes in Technologies of Gender, they serve merely as a marker of boundary, inanimate even when anthropomorphized. Female is what is not susceptible to transformation, to life, or death. Dolores writes, her supposition ironically implicated in the history of Gustave Courbet's unfinished Toilet of the Dead Woman, c. 1850, in which a mirror, judiciously placed if awkwardly introduced by a later painter Baudelaire, is all that was apparently required to transform the limp corpse of the dead woman being prepared for her burial, considered too morbid a topic to assure a good price for the painting, into the happy subject of what came to be known as Toilet of the Bride, figure 33.100. Such a reading of the doll, however, is insufficient to explain why a woman whom the critic Cyril Connolly had designated as one of the mighty-mouthed international geysers of the 19th century should conclude her tenure as a writer of short fiction should in essence go silent with a story in which she abandoned her standard heroines of choice, the Lamias, the Venus Verticordias, the Medias, and the knife riddled Madonnas of the Counter-Reformation, all pomp and whalebone and sorrow and tears wept into Mechlin lace, in favor of one who does nothing and says nothing. 101 History records other immolations, the blazing fires of which has fully consumed the beloved possessions of their votaresses as that which consumed Lee's doll and, by extension, Lee's life as a fabulist. A description of one such ceremony comments indirectly on Lee's final unlikely story, revealing it as less a defeatist gesture than an encoded rite of passage, accessible only to the initiated, who could share sympathetically in its essence. In his reminiscences, Thomas Carlyle recalls the shame that followed his wife's first encounter with Virgil and the grief occasioned by her attempt to rid herself of her shame. She made great progress in Latin, Carlyle begins, and was in Virgil when 9 years old. She always loved her doll, but when she got into Virgil she thought it shame to care for a doll. On her 10th birthday she built a funeral pile of lead pencils and sticks of cinnamon, and poured some sort of perfume over all, to represent a funeral pile. She then recited the speech of Dido, stabbed her doll and let out all the sawdust, after which she consumed her to ashes, and then burst into a passion of tears. 102 Carlyle represents his wife's immolation of her doll as a requisite, if painful, rite of passage, necessitated by her being in Virgil, that is, by her awakening into adulthood and the world of loss and death from out of the untroubled innocence of youth, the author of her fate in this matter being the same poet who ushered Dante through hell and purgatory. Jane Carlyle's choice of eulogy, however, that which serves as the dirge for her doll and the renunciation of her girlhood fancies, is the speech of the Queen of Carthage, who, prior to throwing herself on the sword of Dardania, assembles a huge pyre of oak and pine on which she burns the belongings of Aeneas and his men. Her husband's desertion, the act that she interprets as betrayal, determines her in her suicidal course, although the egoism of her claims to have built a renowned city, to have seen her ramparts rise, and by her brother's punishment to have avenged her husband of his enemy, transforms the apparently self-negating character of her action into something powerfully self-affirming. It is, after all, his body that she would have riven in sunder and strewn on the waves, so that she might have blotted out father and son and race together, but, denied this chance for revenge, she undertakes her own death, which, unavenged, will be the omen he carries on his way. 103. Lee's doll is incapable of such willed self-destruction, requiring instead a narrator sufficiently sensitized to her plight to act for her. And no such angry denunciation as Dido's appears in Lee's narrative, which is instead wholed with silences that demand interpretation, much as the drama of the marionette's meanings is folded in silence. In the olden days, writes first, a marionette performance was called emotion, and this motion, took place in silence. 104 The Countess's reticence in life, compounded by the definitive silence that succeeds it with her death, is absorbed into another silence, yet more resolute, that emerges in the body of the narrative. Discerning some indication of restless incredulity on the part of her confidant, a hint that reminds her of what people are and of how impossible it is ever really to make others feel in the same way as ourselves. 218. The narrator grows jealous of the story that she has embarked upon and announces, almost petulantly, I knew all about the doll when she was alive, I mean about the lady, and I got to know, in the same way, all about her after she was dead. Only I don't think I'll tell you. Basta. 218 to 19. Basta, of course, is the Italian for enough, and as an expletive it mandates silence, as in no more. Enough said, enough heard, silence. The narrator does not literally go silent, she concludes her story with the brief description of the auto da fe over which she presides, but of the doll's hidden life she has nothing more to say. Her silence at just that moment would appear to figure the doll's life as the blank page that invites the inscription from without that Mrs. Ellis claimed would vivify it, preserving it from dead letter status and sanctioning its inclusion in the volume of human life. Spivak later reconceived of this page as the hymenal folded space that invites the pen to disseminate its words, or, as she has it, writes its dissemination. Her conceit is not entirely strained, judging from Belmer's disclosure of the real meaning he expected to discover in the body of his doll, sentenced to successive rearrangement. I wanted to reveal what is usually kept hidden, it was no game. 105. His need to obsessively pull her apart and reconstruct her, however, betrays his fear that what was kept hidden would remain hidden and in the end elude him, leaving him perpetually submerged in the depths he had set about to plumb, perhaps not recognizing meaning when he finds it, suspecting that the meaning he fixes upon might be other than what it presents itself as being, never entirely certain either way. Such is the oppressively suspenseful state that Hoffman claimed would result from one's contact with what is unhamlet, the nothingness of woman, the indeterminacy of the automaton, the whiteness of the sheath, the silence that interrupts speech, the term, as Freud pointed out, shading by degrees into its opposite, heimlich, which itself signifies both what is familiar and agreeable, and what is concealed and kept out of sight. 106 Thus, Lee's contemporary, George Edgerton, could survey the same domain that Belmer later attempted to map out and respond by feeling not threatened by what did not readily present itself to view, but released, as from an immobilizing thraldom. I realized that in literature, everything had been better done by man than woman could hope to emulate. There was only one small plot left for her to tell, the terra incognita of herself, as she knew herself to be, not as man liked to imagine her in a word to give herself away, as man had given himself in his writings. And anatomizing the feminine in this way, she reconfigures those characterizing patches: the plot, the sheet, the silence, the nothingness, the absence about which Goodbar writes most persuasively about in describing 19th and 20th century women's writing as a mysterious but potent act of resistance. 108 The narrator of Lee's story undertakes a potent act of resistance when she assumes her secondary role as Daedago's torchbearer and ritualistically burns the funeral pyre, which she ignites with the flaming pine cone sacred to Dionysus, who shared a mystic connection with Demeter, the central divinity of the Eleusinian mysteries, the preeminent rituals of ancient Athens, rituals that survived for at least 2,000 years. If anthropologists are to be relied upon, Fraser notes in The Golden Bough, for example, that a sect in Warsaw worshipped the late Queen Victoria in her lifetime as their chief divinity, then it would appear that versions of these feminine mysteries involving the worship of the Magna Mater survived well into the 19th century. 109 We might recall, for example, Sarah Orne Jewett's conflation of Victoria and Demeter in The Queen's Twin, 1899, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman's self-imagined role as the more exotic Ashtaroth. In unfolding the doll's secret in silence, however, the narrator discloses her primary role as Hierophant, the highest of the Eleusinian officials, the one whose name means displayer of holy things. Her censure Vasta and the burden of silence it imposes upon the text give a false sense, however, of her ultimate power either to convey or to withhold any information about the doll, whose story the initiated will know without the intervention of an intermediary, just as the narrator herself entered into what she understood to be a sudden friendship with a woman whose secret I had surprised, as sometimes happens, by mere accident. 216. In a fragment from a lost dialogue called On Prayer, Aristotle reveals that the Eleusinian mysteries could not be taught, but only intuited. The philosopher notes that those undergoing initiation are not to learn anything but to experience something and be put into a certain condition. 110 Thus, the central Eleusinian mystery is that transformative moment when, as Lewis R. Farnell notes in his study of the cults of the Greek states, having been placed in a peculiarly close and privileged relation with the divinity or deified spirit, the initiate, or mysts, is assimilated into and comprehended within the mystery that she seeks to comprehend. 111. The narrator's own guide cannot enlighten her in the least, because, as she indicates, I somehow knew everything about the doll, and the information which I gained from Orestes merely confirmed what I was aware of. 21617. She knows all about the doll's life, that is, because she has lived that life. Her narrative performing linguistically the service that the old witch performs physically when she secretly delivers the doll from the obscurity to which she had briefly been consigned, an obscurity from which the housekeeper herself, by virtue of her status as a bastard daughter, cannot hope to be rescued, the recognition of which presumably allows her to enter into a sympathetic engagement with the real lady, 220, whose life would otherwise bear little relationship to her own. Just as the inept descriptions of outrageous angles, unheard of contradictions, and suicidal plunges betray the authorial confusion buried in the lines and patternings of the noxious yellow wallpaper whose aesthetic principle Gilman's tormented narrator has set out to disclose, so the defining features of Lee's eponymous doll suggest that several intersecting narratives are embedded in the life of the doll, the occasion for its recovery itself camouflage, represented as having occurred in the course of the narrator's suitably feminine procuration of bric-a-brac. In this way her story, like that of the old witch housekeeper and behind hers, that of the doll, and enfolding them all that of Lee herself conforms to the code of secrecy imposed by the Eleusinians upon their mysteries, feminine mysteries of transformation that, like the feminine desire that Luce Irigaray writes about, may be recovered only in secret, in hiding, with anxiety and guilt. 112. The Eleusinian mysteries came, of course, to be supplanted by one of the central practices of the early Christian church, the disciplina arcani, in its turn as occult and jealously guarded as the feminine mysteries it sought to subvert. The disciplina arcani is the practice of concealing from heathen and catechumens the more sacred and mysterious doctrines and rites of the church, either by not mentioning them at all or by mentioning them only in enigmatical language. The motive for this, as the historian A. Dwight Culler reminds us, was partly to prepare the candidate gradually for the reception of sacred truths, and partly to preserve the mysteries from violation and sacrilege. 113. The evocative similarity between the two sets of arcane mysteries, those adopted by the church fathers, and those held by the heathen, which some historians take as the source of the Christian sacraments, reminds us that one set of mysteries is as sophisticated as the other, one language as enigmatical as the other, and this the early doctors of the church surely recognized, else they would not have written against Eleusis with such self-incriminating hostility. Harriet Waters Preston found in the example of the 25-year-old Lee evidence of how far the emancipated, encouraged, and enlightened women of the now rising literary generation were beginning to find places among this excellent stock company of writers publishing in such respected journals as the Westminster Review, Blackwood's Magazine, and the Fortnightly. In her own sober claim that no one reads a woman's writing on art, history, or aesthetics with anything but mitigated sick contempt, the subject of Preston's effusions expressed both her doubts about the sincerity of the encouragement an aspiring woman author could expect to receive, although she could not have known of James's allusion in a letter to his brother William to a great second-rate element in her first-rateness. She appears to have discerned sufficient disdain on his part to persuade her that hope of encouragement from that quarter would be ill-founded, and her doubt that the excellent stock company of writers would welcome into their midst a Violet Paget as readily as they would a Vernon Lee 114. The history of the critical reception of her writings would seem to have borne out the accuracy of her estimation, obscured as they were by the withering glare of the enormous condescension of posterity, a condescension more fully disclosed than masked by the courteous language in which Brooks expresses his opinion that by its very nature Lee's overpicked off austere consideration. James's consideration of the dubiety of Lee's first-rateness, Brooks's characterization of her gift as gracious, such assessments suggest that her work would be perceived, at least by some, as merely a more cultured version of the enigmatical language of women's writing that Virginia Woolf had prophesied would come in our own day to be misinterpreted by the uninitiated as expressing not merely a difference of view, but a view that is weak, or trivial, or sentimental. 115. In the years that followed the writing of the doll, Lee focused her energies on exposition, as though she became fully reconciled to a theory she had posed years earlier in Belcaro, specifically, that when art is mature no longer the product of fever-stricken, starved visionaries but of conscientious artists who cease to strain after the impossible and instead set about trying to capture and embody their ever-shifting fancies in definite forms that grow more contrived and decadent, the supernatural ceases to truly exist. 116. Lee's tenure as a writer of supernatural stories culminated with the writing of her final unlikely story, in the apocalyptic ending of which she acknowledges the difficulty of trying to reconcile fancies that might be with facts that are. The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment, the illusion of Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. Sylvia Plath, The Edge, 1963.